October 26, 1967. North of Hanoi, Vietnam. 14,000 feet. The sky was a bruised shade of violet, fading fast into the ink of night. The F-105 Thunderchief shuddered as flak bursts blossomed in the air around it, orange flowers of death blooming in rhythmic bursts. Inside the cockpit, Captain James "Red" Harper gripped the stick tighter, sweat rolling under his oxygen mask. His wingman, Lieutenant Tom Grady, called out through the radio, voice crackling under the roar of engines. "Harper, SAM's at 3 o'clock. Brake right. Brake right." The shriek of the radar lock cut through his headset, that rising metallic wail that every pilot dreaded. Harper yanked hard, but it was too late. A Soviet-made Say-2 missile tore through the sky and struck his tail. The cockpit exploded in light and force. Metal screamed. The world flipped upside down. Harper's training took over. Pull the handles, eject, and in an instant, the canopy blasted away. He was hurled into the freezing wind, tumbling through black smoke and orange fire. Below him, the jungles of North Vietnam spread like a dark ocean. He could hear his heart pounding louder than the flak. Then, the chute snapped open. Silence. Just the sound of the wind and the faint thud of explosions below. He hit the ground hard in a rice paddy, mud exploding around him. Pain surged through his right leg. Broken, maybe. He could smell the smoke of burning jet fuel drifting in from the crash site. He knew he had minutes before the local militia found him. He tried to crawl toward the tree-line, dragging his leg through the wet soil, whispering to himself, "Stay low, stay alive." But voices came. Lanterns. The shimmer of bayonets. When they found him, they didn't speak. They just pointed rifles and shouted. He was struck in the side of the head and everything went black. When Harper woke, his hands were bound, his helmet gone. His ears rang with the sound of a distant city and the hum of truck engines. A burlap sack was over his head. He was being dragged, then shoved into the back of a transport. The air inside stank of diesel and fear, the kind that only prisoners knew. Hours blurred into days. Rough handling. Sparse water. Interrogations in dim rooms lit by a single bulb. When the sack finally came off, Harper saw the faded concrete walls of what would become his world, the Hoa Lo Prison, nicknamed by American POWs, the Hanoi Hilton. The air inside was stale. The windows were barred. And somewhere down the corridor, he heard the faintest, strangest thing, a knock. Then another. A series of taps. Rhythmic. Intentional. He froze, listening. It wasn't random noise. It came in clusters, 3 short, 1 long, 2 short. Like code. Someone's alive, he thought. Someone's talking. He pressed his ear to the wall. For the first time since his capture, he wasn't alone. Weeks later, Harper would meet Lieutenant Tom Grady again, though not face to face. They'd been placed in adjacent cells, separated by a concrete wall barely 8 inches thick. Their first reunion came not through sight or voice, but through sound, those soft knocks echoing in the dark. Grady tapped. Harper answered. Slowly, painfully, they began to build a language, the tap code that would soon spread through the prison like wildfire. Every letter, every word, a defiance. Every knock, a heartbeat of resistance. And through those walls of stone and iron, hope began to move again. If you're watching this, wherever you are, take a second to imagine the sound of that first knock. In a place built to break men, it was the start of something unbreakable. And if stories like this move you, hit that like button, and let us know where you're watching from. Because tonight, we're stepping inside the walls of the Hanoi Hilton. Hanoi, North Vietnam, November 1967. The air in the cell was damp and heavy, thick with mildew and the faint scent of rusted iron. Captain James "Red" Harper sat with his back against the wall, knees pulled close, counting the cracks in the concrete. He wasn't sure how long he'd been here. Days bled into weeks, and sunlight only existed as a dim orange glow through a barred vent. He'd learned the rhythm of the place. The distant shuffle of boots at dawn. The rattle of tin bowls at mealtime. The clang of a gate when someone was taken for interrogation, and sometimes the silence that followed meant they wouldn't return. And yet, in that silence, a new sound had begun to live. The taps. At first, they were faint, barely audible through the thick cement walls. But Harper had trained his ear. He'd realized they weren't random knocks of metal or footsteps. They carried pattern. He waited one evening, his ear pressed against the wall, straining to hear through the distant echo of dripping water. Then it came again. 3 taps, a pause, 2 taps. 3 to 2. He frowned, then answered back with the same rhythm, using his knuckles. Pause. Then another sequence came, slower this time. 2-1-4. He had no idea what it meant. But he knew there was someone on the other side. 2 cells down, Lieutenant Tom Grady sat cross-legged on the cold floor, his hand bruised from hours of tapping. He was the one who'd started it, desperate to reach anyone. The first few days after his capture had been pure darkness. The interrogations had stripped away everything human. They'd taken his name, his rank, even his ability to speak. Silence was survival here. But Grady refused to disappear. He remembered something his father, a Navy radioman, once said when he was a boy. If you ever find yourself cut off, Tommy, you'll always have sound. Sound can cross anything. So he'd started experimenting. He drew a grid in the dirt, 5 by 5, and began assigning letters to positions. A equals 1 to 1, B equals 1 to 2, C equals 1 to 3, and so on. The letter K was merged with C to fit 25 letters into 5 rows and 5 columns. It was crude, slow, but it worked. When he tapped 2 to 1, it meant F. When he tapped 3 to 3, it meant N. Letter by letter, sound by sound, he could speak again. For weeks, the walls of Hoa Lo began to talk. From one cell to another, the message spread, passed by word of mouth during brief glimpses in the yard or whispered through keyholes when guards weren't watching. Soon, nearly every captured pilot knew the system. They tapped to share names. They tapped to share hope. And sometimes, they tapped to say goodbye. One cold morning, Harper heard the sound again, clearer this time. He crouched close, whispering softly to himself, translating the rhythm in his mind. 1 to 3, 4 to 4, 3 to 1, 5 to 5. He whispered, barely audible. Name. Why? It hit him. Tom Grady. He slammed his fist on the wall, heart pounding. 2 taps, pause, 4 taps. Their signal for yes. From the other side came a burst of rapid knocks, laughter through rhythm. It wasn't just code. It was reunion. "Tom, you son of a gun!" Harper whispered under his breath, smiling for the first time in months. That night, they spoke in rhythm until their hands were raw. They talked about home, about missions gone wrong, about wives and sweethearts they hadn't seen in years. Every sound mattered. Every tap was defiance against silence, a language of resistance born in darkness. But not everyone approved. The guards began to notice the strange patterns, prisoners tapping walls, pausing at the same time. The Vietnamese officers called it wall noise. They threatened punishment if it continued. Yet the men refused to stop. "You can take our voices," Harper once tapped, "but you'll never take our words." The phrase would echo through the cells like scripture. And in the weeks to come, the wall noise would evolve into one of the most extraordinary systems of human communication ever built under torture and captivity. If you're still watching, you've just stepped deeper into the heart of the Hanoi Hilton, where courage didn't shout, it whispered. Tell me in the comments. If you heard that first tap in the dark, would you have risked everything to answer? Don't forget to subscribe, because the next part of this story will show how the tap code became a weapon stronger than any rifle. December 1967, Hoa Lo Prison, Hanoi. The cell block slept in darkness. The kind of darkness so complete that even the moonlight seemed afraid to enter. In the stillness, you could hear the faint breathing of a dozen men in a dozen concrete coffins, each one counting the seconds until morning. But for Captain Harper and Lieutenant Grady, night had become their classroom. Harper sat cross-legged on the floor, fingers pressed to the cold stone. The skin around his knuckles was cracked and raw from days of tapping. But he didn't stop. Every tap meant something. Every tap mattered. 1 to 1, 1 to 2, 1 to 3, 1 to 4, 1-5. A, B, C, D, E. He whispered the grid quietly to himself, committing it to memory. 5 rows. 5 columns. 25 letters. The simplest code in the world, and yet it was keeping an entire brotherhood alive. On the other side of the wall, Grady tapped back. His rhythm was steady now, confident. They had refined the system, turning random knocks into structured language. It was as if Morse code had evolved, born not from radio waves, but from human will. Each day, more prisoners learned it. During brief work details or rare group wash times, they'd teach each other the grid. Sometimes they scratched it into the dirt with a pebble. Sometimes they whispered it into a man's ear as he was dragged past for interrogation. One of the older prisoners, Commander Al Parsons, a Navy pilot captured a year before, had become the keeper of the system. He'd memorized the entire code and passed it on like scripture. 5 by 5, boys, Parsons would whisper. 5 by 5. That's all you need to keep your mind sharp and your soul free. At night, the cell blocks would come alive. The guards called it ghost talk. Soft clicks and knocks echoing through the corridors, bouncing off the stone like the heartbeat of something defiant. If you stood in the hallway at the right time, you could almost feel it, a pulse of life hidden beneath layers of concrete and fear. For the Americans inside, it became everything. Through it, they shared memories of home. They told jokes, relayed news, even organized resistance, all under the noses of their captors. One evening, Grady tapped a story about his wife. How she used to wait for him at the end of the runway after every mission, waving that same red scarf he'd bought her in Saigon. When Harper heard it, he replied with a message that made Grady's chest tighten. Still waving. Don't forget that. And though neither man could see the other, both smiled into the dark. But the code wasn't just for comfort. It was for survival. In a place where torture was routine, where the Vietnamese guards used isolation to break the mind, the tap code gave them power. The power to warn, to plan, to resist. If a man was taken for interrogation, the others would tap messages of encouragement through the wall. God be with you. If a man returned beaten and broken, they'd send words of pride and honor. Sometimes they'd even pass on coded prayers, short rhythmic phrases that no captor could decipher. Harper began to understand something profound, that communication wasn't just sound. It was connection. The difference between despair and defiance. He realized that as long as they could communicate, they could fight, even without weapons. Then came the day it almost ended. A new officer arrived at Hoa Lo. A hard man with a face like carved stone. The prisoners called him the Bear. He had one mission, to silence the walls. One morning, the guards stormed through the cell blocks. They listened for the taps. When they heard them, They dragged the prisoners responsible into the courtyard. Harper was among them. The bear demanded to know what the wall noise meant. No one spoke. When Harper stayed silent, the blows came fast, the butt of a rifle, the lash of a belt. Blood hit the ground. But he didn't say a word. Later that night, barely conscious, he lay on the floor of his cell. His body trembled, but his hand moved. One finger lifted weakly and tapped. 5 to 5. Good night. From somewhere far down the corridor came the reply. 5 to 5. Even half dead, the code survived. Days turned into weeks, and the guards learned to ignore the soft clicks that no torture could silence. The ghost talk continued, sometimes louder, sometimes faint, but always there. The code spread beyond the walls of the Hanoi Hilton, carried to other camps as new prisoners arrived. It became a network, invisible, indestructible, unstoppable. And through it, a message passed between every man who had been broken, starved, beaten, and yet refused to surrender. We are still here. January 1968, Hoa Lo Prison, Hanoi. Rain hammered against the corrugated roof that morning. Cold water ran down the walls in thin black streams, pooling beneath Harper's shackled feet. He sat in the corner, trembling from fever and exhaustion. The air was heavy with smoke from a nearby brazier, filling the cell with the sour taste of burnt wood and rot. But beneath the hiss of the rain and the coughs of the dying, there was still sound. The faintest tap, tap-tap, tap-tap-tap. It was the rhythm of the tap code, weaker now, but alive. Harper had spent 3 months inside Hoa Lo. His body had been broken, but his mind had sharpened. He'd memorized not only the code, but the patterns of the guards, when they walked the corridor, when they stopped for a cigarette, when they dozed off in the chair by the gate. He had turned the silence into a weapon. Late at night, when the guards changed shifts, Harper and Grady would start a chain message, passing word cell by cell like invisible ink through stone. They warned each other when interrogations were coming. They shared which guards were cruel and which ones might look away. They even coordinated acts of quiet rebellion, refusing to sign false confessions, staying silent during propaganda recordings, resisting every small demand meant to humiliate them. It was coordination, through nothing but sound. In Cell 4, Commander Al Parsons had an idea. He tapped one night to Harper. Talk to new man's cell. A new pilot had just been captured, a young Navy flyer named Lieutenant Billy Masters, shot down over Haiphong Bay. He was terrified. The guards had isolated him in the far corner of the block. They wanted to break him before he met the others. But Parsons knew the tap code could reach him before fear did. So Harper waited until midnight, when the corridor fell silent, and began tapping across the wall to the cell beside his, then the next, and the next, passing the message like a lifeline. When the pattern reached Masters, the boy froze in the dark. He didn't understand at first. Then he remembered a briefing from SEER training, something about a secret POW code. He pressed his ear to the wall. The taps repeated. 1-1, 1-2, 1-3, A, B, C. Tears filled his eyes as realization hit him. They were talking to him. He wasn't alone. That night, through a chain of concrete and defiance, the new pilot learned the code. By dawn, he had memorized all 25 letters. By the end of the week, he was sending messages himself, stories of his capture, names of others, everything he could recall from outside. The tap code had recruited another soldier. Then, something extraordinary began to happen. The Americans discovered that they could organize. They elected covert leaders, set up morale committees, and even created a hierarchy, all through rhythmic tapping. Each group of cells became a squad. They passed orders, encouraged unity, and refused collaboration. When the guards tried to divide them, they failed, because even when separated by walls, the men were connected by sound. Harper was amazed by how effective it became. In his cell, he began writing imaginary reports in his head, as if he were still briefing his squadron back home. The difference was, now his orders traveled not through radio, but through fingertips. Stay strong. Stay silent. Communicate. That was the unspoken creed. But the code also carried secrets. Through it, the prisoners were able to share critical information about the conditions in Hoa Lo, the starvation, the torture, the propaganda. They memorized names of captives, injury reports, and escape attempts. When released POWs were eventually freed or exchanged, those details were smuggled back to American intelligence. The U.S. military would later confirm that the TAP code became one of the few functioning communication networks behind enemy lines, built entirely inside prison walls. Still, every victory came at a cost. One evening, guards caught a group of prisoners whispering the code out loud, using coughs instead of taps. The Vietnamese officers stormed the block, dragging men into the yard. Among them was Lieutenant Billy Masters. The others could hear it, the boots, the shouting, the screams. No one dared move, but everyone listened. And when the night grew still again, they waited. Then, faintly, from the farthest cell, came 2 slow taps. 5 to 5. The signal for, okay. Billy was alive. Bruised, bloodied, but unbroken. In the days that followed, Harper couldn't shake the feeling that they had built something sacred, something stronger than flesh. He sat in the dark and thought about sound, how it had carried across space, across war, and now, through the very walls that tried to silence it. The TAP code wasn't just communication anymore. It was identity. Each man who learned it became part of something eternal, a brotherhood built not on sight or speech, but rhythm. "You know what's crazy?" the narrator says softly. "That code, it still works. It's been passed down through generations of U.S. airmen, a secret tradition of resilience. If you're watching right now, and you believe that courage isn't always loud, that sometimes it's just a whisper in the dark, drop a candle emoji in the comments. And if you're new here, subscribe. Because what happens next will test the strength of the code like never before. March 1968, the interrogation block, Hoa Lo Prison. The corridor smelled of lime and blood. Each step echoed like the ticking of a clock running out of time. Captain Harper's bare feet slipped on the wet floor as 2 guards dragged him by the arms. His wrists were bound with wire so tight that blood pooled beneath the skin. Every nerve screamed. He'd been here before, the room of truth, they called it. A cement box with a wooden chair bolted to the ground and a single, naked bulb hanging above it. The air was heavy with heat. On one side of the room sat a Vietnamese officer in a gray uniform. His expression was calm, almost bored, as if this were a job no more meaningful than fixing a leaky faucet. They called him the Bear, and he lived up to it. On the table beside him lay a stack of papers, confession forms, propaganda scripts, and a small black-and-white photograph of Harper's family that had been found in his flight vest. His wife. His little girl. "Captain Harper," the Bear said in flat English, "you talk to the wall. We hear you at night. You tell your friends not to resist. We can make this easy." Harper said nothing. His throat was dry. The officer sighed and motioned to the guard. The first blow came fast, a whip made of twisted electrical cable. It slashed across Harper's back, cutting through skin and cloth. He gasped but didn't scream. Another strike. Then another. "We know you use code," the Bear said. "You tell us how it works, or we keep going." Harper looked up slowly, blood running down his shoulder. And then, with the faintest flicker of a smile, he whispered, "You'll never understand it. When they threw him back into his cell, he collapsed onto the floor. His body trembled uncontrollably, but his mind was alive with sound. He pressed his cheek to the wall and started tapping. Weak, uneven, but clear. 4-5/3-5/4-5/1-4/4-2. Tough but fine. A moment later, the reply came. 2-1/3-to-1/1-5/2-4/5-5. Faith hold. It was Grady. They didn't need to say more. For every man who broke, another held the line. That was the unspoken pact of the tap code. If you can't speak, someone else will speak for you. The Vietnamese interrogators soon realized that the American spirit wasn't just stubbornness. It was organized defiance. Every time they isolated a man, the others would reinforce him through the walls, tapping messages of hope, prayers, even jokes. One night, when Harper was too weak to sit up, he heard a slow rhythm coming through the concrete. 1-1/4-5/2-3/5-5. Jesus loves you. He couldn't help it. He smiled. For a moment, the pain faded. By the summer of 1968, the Americans had turned the tap code into a full communication network. They'd even created shortcuts, abbreviations that only they understood. 99 meant guards nearby. 86 meant interrogation tonight. 00 meant hold fast. To anyone else, it was random noise. But to them, it was structure, a secret heartbeat that kept morale alive. When new POWs arrived, they were immediately taught the code, even before learning where they were. It spread faster than the guards could suppress it. The bear grew furious. Punishments grew harsher: isolation cells, starvation, mock executions. But still, the walls talked. Harper had come to believe that the code was more than survival. It was rebellion made manifest. Each tap said, "I am still human. You can't erase me." Then one night, the system was tested like never before. A pilot named Lieutenant Robert Bobby Dean broke. He'd been in solitary for weeks, beaten nearly blind. When the bear promised him better treatment in exchange for information, Dean gave up the code, or what he thought was the code. The next morning, guards went cell to cell, tapping strange patterns on the walls, testing. But what Dean had given them was wrong. Harper had changed the matrix days before. What the guards thought was "hello" actually translated to lies. The moment Harper heard their test message, he knew. He tapped fast down the corridor. Code compromised new grid /3/4/2/5. Within hours, the entire prison had switched to a new tap code layout, coordinated entirely through sound. The Vietnamese never figured out what had happened. The Americans had outmaneuvered them, with nothing but their knuckles. That night, Grady sent Harper one last message before lights out. "Sound is stronger than pain." And Harper tapped back. "You can silence men, not the truth." September 1968, Hoa Lo Prison, North Vietnam. Rain came again, pounding like artillery on the tin roofs above the cell blocks. To most men, it was misery, cold, endless, numbing. But to the American prisoners inside Hoa Lo, it was cover. When the rain was loud enough, the guards couldn't hear the taps. That was when orders moved. Commander Al Parsons had become the de facto leader of the prisoners, though the Vietnamese had no idea. From his cell deep in Block D, he coordinated over 60 men across multiple wings of the prison through nothing more than the tap code. The network was structured like a military chain of command. Something Parsons had once built in the Navy, now rebuilt inside hell. Each cell leader was responsible for teaching, messaging, and maintaining morale. Messages moved cell by cell, slow but unstoppable. It could take a full day to transmit a single paragraph. But for the men, Every word was a victory. Captain Harper served as Parsons' adjacent relay. His cell, located near the center of the block, acted as a hub, a switchboard. Every evening, he waited for the rain or for the guards to sleep, and then he would start tapping. He relayed instructions. Maintain order. No propaganda cooperation. Encourage prayer and humor. He also sent morale updates, coded poems, and Bible verses, anything to remind the men they were still part of something greater. In that darkness, the walls became their battlefield, and the tap code became their weapon. The code was used for everything. When a man was sick, the next cell tapped for help. When food was spoiled, they warned others not to eat it. When a prisoner died, and it happened more often than anyone admitted, a final message would move down the walls like a funeral procession. 5-5/3-2/4-3/2-2/1-1. Gone home. Even death had rhythm. Then one day, something miraculous happened. A guard, new to the prison, made a mistake. He left a supply crate near the interrogation yard. Inside, scraps of paper used to wrap cigarettes. One of the prisoners, a resourceful Air Force captain named Rick O'Donnell, managed to pocket a few slivers of it during work detail. That night, the message went out. We have paper. It spread like wildfire. For the first time in months, they could write. Using burnt matches and bits of charcoal, they scribbled fragments of poetry, coded prayer lists, and notes for new arrivals. The risk was enormous. If found, it meant torture. But the reward was priceless. It wasn't about escape anymore. It was about memory. They wanted proof of life, of endurance, of brotherhood, something that would survive even if they didn't. Those scraps of paper were hidden inside cracks in the walls, rolled into cigarette filters, even buried beneath floorboards. Years later, when Hoa Lo was finally opened to journalists, some of those messages would be found. The handwriting faint, the ink smudged, but the words defiant. We talk through walls. We will never stop. By late 1969, the tap code had turned Hoa Lo into an invisible command center. It was an underground military structure operating entirely beneath the noses of their captors. Prisoners coordinated hunger strikes, moral resistance, and even the refusal to participate in North Vietnamese propaganda films. When one man was ordered to speak on camera, he tapped through the wall asking, "Do I comply?" The answer came back, "Do not break." He didn't. He stood in front of the camera, bruised and hollow, and when asked to condemn the United States, he repeated instead, in monotone English, "I am proud of my country." The guards couldn't understand why the other prisoners later clapped through the walls for hours. To them, it was just more noise. To the Americans, it was victory. One night, Harper tapped something new to Grady. A question that had been eating at him. Why keep fighting if no hope? The answer came slower than usual. Then, deliberate. Because we are the hope. Harper stared at the wall, eyes wet. He could almost see Grady's grin on the other side, that same cocky smirk from before the war. In that moment, he realized that what they were doing wasn't just survival. It was history in motion. By 1970, even the North Vietnamese began to notice something strange. The American prisoners were not breaking. They were organizing. They showed unity, discipline, defiance, impossible traits for men locked in isolation. And though the guards increased punishments, every strike of the whip only made the code stronger. Every wall became a transmitter. Every hand, a message. Every breath, resistance. Hoa Lo had become the quietest rebellion in the history of war. It's easy to think that courage looks like charging into gunfire, the narrator's voice says quietly. But sometimes it looks like a hand trembling in the dark, tapping 5 little beats that mean don't give up. If you believe that bravery doesn't always need noise, tap that like button. And tell me in the comments, What would you have done if your only voice was the sound of your own knuckles? March 1970, Hoa Lo Prison, Hanoi. The walls had begun to breathe. Not literally, but every man who lived inside Hoa Lo could feel it. The walls carried words: hope, prayer, defiance. The walls remembered. Captain Harper had been in captivity for nearly 3 years. His body bore the marks of every interrogation, but his spirit, that was something the Vietnamese could never cage. His hands had become tools of rebellion, his knuckles as vital as any weapon he'd ever carried. He no longer measured time by days or months, but by conversations. Every night, every exchange of taps was proof that he, and they, still existed. That morning, the guards brought a new prisoner. The courtyard echoed with the sharp sound of boots on wet concrete and the guttural orders in Vietnamese. Harper could hear it from his cell, the shuffle of a limp, the thud of a body pushed through a door. Minutes later, he heard the sobbing. Young, frightened. Someone new. He pressed his hand to the wall. Waited. Then started tapping, slow and patient. 1 to 1, 1 to 2. 1 to 3. A, B, C. The crying stopped. There was silence. Then faintly, one tap. Then another. Broken, uncertain. But it was something. A few hours later, word had spread through the entire block. New pilot, name's Peters. Navy. Within a day, they had taught him the entire tap code. That's how fast it worked now. The code had become instinct, a language of the soul, passed from one heartbeat to another. Each day brought new risks. The guards had grown obsessed with uncovering the communication network. They'd begun moving prisoners randomly, shuffling cells to disrupt the pattern. But it didn't work. The code adapted. Every time a man was relocated, the network adjusted. New routes, new relays, new patterns. It was like watching a living organism mutate in real time, evolving faster than its captors could react. To the Vietnamese, it was chaos. To the Americans, it was command. One humid night, when the air itself seemed to stick to the skin, Harper received a message from Parsons. New mission begin tomorrow. Harper frowned in the dark. A mission. In prison. The next evening, as the guards switched shifts, the meaning became clear. The men began transmitting a coordinated morale broadcast, the first in the history of Hoa Lo. Each cell, at a precise moment, began tapping the same phrase through the walls. It started in Block D. Then Block C picked it up. Then Block B. Like a wave of sound rolling through the prison. We are still here. We are still here. We are still here. Over and over. For nearly 10 minutes, the entire Hanoi Hilton pulsed with the rhythm of unity. The guards panicked. They shouted, banged on doors, fired rifles into the air. But the sound didn't stop. The taps kept coming. Faster, louder, unstoppable. For the first time since capture, Harper laughed. The code had become an anthem. When it finally went quiet, he sat back, heart racing, drenched in sweat and joy. He realized that for a brief moment, they hadn't been prisoners, they'd been soldiers again. Fighting. Communicating. Commanding. It wasn't about escape anymore. It was about identity. Even in cages, they were men of the United States Armed Forces, and they refused to let the world forget that. But with rebellion came punishment. The next morning, the guards stormed through the block. They dragged Harper, Grady, Parsons, and a dozen others into the courtyard. The bear was waiting. He looked each man in the eye and said coldly, "You think walls talk? Today, walls will cry." They were beaten, one by one. But the prisoners refused to scream. They didn't need to. because down the corridor, behind closed doors, another sound was rising, quiet but defiant. Ap, ap, ap. The men in other cells had picked up the rhythm again. They were echoing their brother's pain, letting them know they weren't alone. Even through agony, the code spoke. That night, when Harper was thrown back into his cell, bleeding and half-conscious, he lifted one trembling hand. His fingers barely worked, but he tapped, once, twice. A pause. Then the reply came. It wasn't a word this time. It was music. A simple rhythm they'd used for months, the cadence of When Johnny Comes Marching Home. Slow, steady, hopeful. Harper smiled through split lips. He tapped along. In that dark, stinking cell, with blood drying on his skin, he could almost see home. October 1970, Hoa Lo Prison, North Vietnam. It had been 3 long years since Captain Harper had last seen the open sky. 3 years of concrete, hunger, and the endless rhythm of tapping that had become the sound of survival. But on this particular night, something different moved through the code. Something Harper hadn't felt before. News. It started in the far block, faint but distinct, a rapid sequence that traveled from cell to cell, like a fuse running through the prison's veins. He pressed his ear to the wall and listened carefully as the message arrived. New prisoners from Santui. Harper froze. Sun Tay. That was another prison camp, one he'd only heard of in whispers. He tapped back, urgent now. REPEAT. The message came again, this time with more detail. The new prisoners had been brought in only days ago. They carried stories from the outside. Among them was a name, Major James Rowe. Rowe had survived years in the jungle before escaping. His story had spread across camps before being smothered by silence. And now, his name echoed once again through Hoa Lo's walls, proof that escape, though near impossible, wasn't just fantasy. When Harper finally heard the next sequence, his pulse quickened. America knows we are here. He sat back, stunned. For the first time, the message wasn't about endurance, it was about recognition. The new prisoners brought word of the American anti-war movement, of politicians in Washington demanding answers about missing pilots. And most of all, of families who hadn't stopped fighting for them. Wives, mothers, children, marching with photos of their loved ones, chanting, "Bring them home." Through the walls, that news spread like wildfire. For men who'd been forgotten by time, it was resurrection. In Cell 12, Lieutenant Tom Grady heard the message secondhand. His heart nearly burst in his chest. He tapped to Harper, his rhythm shaky with excitement. "They know my name." Harper smiled into the dark and answered, "Yes, they know all our names." Grady leaned his head against the wall and closed his eyes. For the first time in years, he didn't feel invisible. The effect on morale was electric. Men who had barely moved in months began to talk again. The sound of laughter, soft, cautious, returned to the cell blocks. Even the guards noticed the change. They didn't understand the sudden light in the prisoners' eyes, the quiet smiles that appeared where despair used to live. But the Americans knew. The outside world had heard them. And that meant the tap code, the very language that had kept them alive, had worked. That same week, another coded message arrived, more complex than anything before. It took hours to decode, passing from cell to cell. Attempted raid on Santui failed, but we are not forgotten. Harper read the message twice in his head. A failed raid, yes. But it meant something far greater. The U.S. military had tried to rescue them. That knowledge exploded through the prison like dynamite. The Americans had come for them. The government had not abandoned them. Even in failure, it was victory. The guards could sense the change. They could see it in the posture of the men, in their refusal to bow, in the glint of defiance in their eyes. And soon, retaliation followed. The bear returned. He ordered the prisoners separated once more, intensifying interrogations, enforcing silence. But by now, silence meant nothing. The code could be transmitted in infinite ways, through tapping, through coughs, even through blinks. Harper remembered one day, while being paraded before propaganda cameras, he blinked in rhythm. 5 short, 1 long, 5 short. To the Vietnamese, it was nothing. To the Americans watching later, it spelled a word burned into his soul. HOME. By 1971, even the North Vietnamese officers began to fear what the code represented. They could break bodies, but not unity. No amount of isolation could stop a message that had learned to travel without sound. The Americans had turned captivity into a form of command, a leadership structure hidden inside the rhythm of survival. They were soldiers without weapons, officers without ranks, but still a unit. One night, Harper tapped something simple to Grady. "Someday we will tell this story." Grady answered, "And they won't believe it." Harper smiled into the dark. "They will hear the taps." And across the block, dozens of hands rose. Dozens of men joined in, soft, synchronized, defiant. The sound of freedom, disguised as knocks. "Imagine hearing that," the narrator's voice says, hushed but reverent. A chorus of prisoners, tapping the word home into stone. If that gives you chills, drop a United States in the comments, because these men weren't done fighting. In the next part, we'll see how the tap code not only survived, it escaped, carried across oceans and into history. February 1971, Hanoi, North Vietnam. The monsoon had come early that year. Rain poured down the prison walls like molten lead, carrying the smell of rust and sewage through the corridors. But inside the cells of Hoa Lo, something invisible was happening. Something the guards could not see, could not stop. The tap code had gone beyond the walls. It began with a man named Major Bill Andrews, an Air Force pilot who had been transferred from another camp. When he arrived, he was battered and malnourished, but his eyes still held the glint of command. Through the taps, he told Harper and Parsons that he had been part of a prisoner transfer from a smaller camp near Haiphong. Before he left that camp, the men there had created a system, one that allowed coded information to be smuggled through released prisoners and Red Cross interviews. And now, they wanted to link the Hanoi Hilton to that network. It was audacious, nearly suicidal. But the moment Harper heard it, he knew it had to happen. Because if the tap code could move beyond these walls, then the world could finally hear them. They started small. When a prisoner was scheduled for release or transfer, Harper and Parsons worked through the nights, tapping messages to him, word by word, to memorize. Each letter, each phrase was stored not on paper, but in the mind, locked away behind bruises and scars. When the man left, those words went with him. Names of prisoners, conditions, proof of life, coordinates of the prison camps. And when that man reached freedom, or the hands of the Red Cross, those messages were written down and delivered to military intelligence. It took months, but slowly, the outside world began to piece together the truth. The Americans were alive. They were communicating. They were resisting. By late 1971, U.S. officials began receiving reports containing details that could only have come from inside Hoa Lo. Dates, names, even guard routines. No one could explain how that information escaped. But inside the prison, Harper knew. Every time he tapped the wall, he imagined his message traveling, through concrete, through men, through memory, until it reached someone on the other side of the world. Then came the message that changed everything. A new prisoner, captured in Laos, arrived at Hoa Lo. His name was Captain Douglas Harlow. He was young, quiet, and carrying a story that none of them could believe. He'd been interrogated by North Vietnamese officers who'd shown him a newspaper clipping, an American headline. It read, "Families of POWs demand answers. Code system suspected." Harlow remembered the photo. A group of women holding signs with the names of missing airmen. One of them, Sarah Harper. Harper froze when he heard that name tapped through the wall. He could almost feel his wife's face again, the curve of her smile, the sound of her laugh. She was still fighting. And somehow, she knew he was alive. He leaned his forehead against the wall, tears welling in his eyes, and tapped. "Tell them we hear their voices." The reply came instantly. "They hear ours." It wasn't long after that the guards began to notice the change. The men stood taller. They looked their captors in the eye. Even during interrogations, the fear had drained away, replaced by something harder, unbreakable. The bear could sense it. He screamed at them, cursed them, beat them. But it was like punching smoke. The more he hit, the stronger they became. Because now they knew. The world was listening. One evening, as dusk fell and the air turned cool for the first time in months, Harper started tapping a message he had been saving for weeks. He tapped to Parsons. Parsons relayed it to the next cell. And soon, the word spread across the entire block, one phrase moving through dozens of men, cell to cell, like a heartbeat of unity. Not silenced, not forgotten, still free. From the farthest cell, Grady's reply came, strong and sure. Free in the heart. That became their motto, their battle cry in captivity. Men scratched it into their bowls. Whispered it before sleep. Tapped it during storms when the walls seemed to hum. Free in the heart. And then, months later, a strange thing happened. The guards stopped listening. The beatings slowed. The propaganda softened. Rumors drifted in through whispers and new captives. Peace talks, negotiations, prisoner exchanges. It was as if the world outside was shifting, inch by inch, toward something that might finally end it all. But Harper and the others didn't dare believe it yet. They had learned the hard way that hope could be dangerous. Still, when the night came quiet, and he pressed his ear against the wall, he could hear the rhythm of hundreds of men, tapping softly, endlessly. Hope, hope, hope. February 12, 1973, Gia Lam Airport, Hanoi, North Vietnam. The airstrip shimmered in the early morning haze, heat rising off the concrete like ghosts of 1,000 lost dreams. At the edge of the tarmac stood a line of men in ragged uniforms, thin, pale, hollow-eyed, yet unbroken. Among them was Captain James "Red" Harper. His wrists bore the scars of wire cuffs. His eyes, once bright blue, were faded and sunken. But when he looked toward the horizon and saw the C-141 Starlifter aircraft bearing the insignia of the United States Air Force, something inside him came alive again. After 6 long years, freedom had come. Inside the cells of Hoa Lo, the day had begun like any other. The guards had brought the morning rations, rice and thin soup. But instead of shouting orders, they spoke softly, almost politely. Then came the announcement. "You go home now." At first, no one moved. The words didn't make sense. Go home. It wasn't until the gates opened, until they saw the buses waiting outside the courtyard, that reality hit. The nightmare was ending. Harper could hardly walk. His legs still bore the limp from that first crash in 1967. But when the guards gestured for him to move, he straightened, lifted his chin, and took the first step forward. As the buses rolled through Hanoi's crowded streets, the prisoners stared out the windows in silence. They passed markets, bicycles, children, the world they'd forgotten still moving, indifferent to their suffering. Grady sat beside Harper, his hand trembling. "Do you think it's real?" he whispered. Harper smiled faintly. "If it's a dream, don't wake me up." When the buses reached Gia Lam, the sound of jet engines filled the air. Deep, thunderous, American. And for the first time in years, the prisoners cried without shame. At the gate, American officers waited. Clean uniforms, sharp salutes, cameras rolling. A senior officer stepped forward and said, voice cracking, "Welcome home, gentlemen." Harper blinked in disbelief. The words echoed through him like the tap code itself. Short, deliberate, powerful. He looked at Grady, who grinned through tears. "Told you we'd tell the story someday." Harper nodded. "And they won't believe it." When it was their turn, Harper and Grady stepped toward the transport aircraft. A medic tried to help Harper up the ramp, but he waved him off, standing tall. He stopped at the base, looked back one last time at the North Vietnamese soldiers, and tapped his knuckles softly against the railing. 1-3/5-5. C/Y. Code complete. Then he boarded. Inside the C-141, the smell of disinfectant and coffee filled the air, alien scents after years of mildew and decay. The men were handed blankets, chocolate, and real food. Many couldn't eat. Their bodies had forgotten how. As the engines roared to life, Harper pressed his hand to the window. He could see the city shrinking below, the rooftops, the river, the prison far off in the distance. And though he couldn't hear it anymore, he imagined the sound still echoing through those walls. Tap, tap, tap. The rhythm of defiance that had carried them through 6 years of hell. When the plane crossed the coastline, a cheer erupted. Men wept, shouted, hugged. Grady leaned close to Harper and whispered, "We made it home, brother." Harper's voice was soft but steady. "No, the code made it home." Operation Homecoming lasted from February to April 1973. In total, 591 American POWs were repatriated. Many carried secrets the world could scarcely imagine. Scars, nightmares, and a language born in captivity. When reporters asked how they had endured, the answer was simple. "We talked through the walls." It became legend. The tap code, 5 rows, 5 columns, 25 letters, had done what no chain, no cell, no tyrant could undo. It had kept them human. Months later, Harper stood in front of a crowd of journalists and families at Maxwell Air Force Base. His voice trembled as he addressed them. "We learned something in those walls," he said. "That freedom doesn't live outside, it lives in here." He tapped his chest. "You can silence a voice, but not the will behind it." He paused, then smiled. "And if you ever hear someone knocking from the dark, answer back." That night, as he sat in his quiet home, his daughter asleep upstairs, Harper found himself listening to the stillness. It was strange, too quiet after so many years of coded sound. So he reached out, and with the tip of his finger, tapped the kitchen table. 5-5. The reply, of course, never came. But he smiled anyway, because he knew that somewhere, someone was still listening. "That was the sound of freedom," the narrator says, voice breaking slightly. "A rhythm that crossed time, pain, and war." If you made it this far, hit that like button. You've just walked through history most people have never heard. Drop a comment where you're watching from, and if you believe courage doesn't need a voice, just a knock. Subscribe, because there are more stories like this waiting in the dark, ready to be heard.